The biblical God dictates the exact terms of engagement. When humanity approaches the divine, there is zero room for unauthorized creativity. In the 1640s, the Westminster Assembly convened in London. Their objective was to dismantle the existing Anglican worship system, specifically targeting the highly structured rituals of the Book of Common Prayer. The Assembly identified a fatal flaw in the Anglican approach. The established church operated on a simple assumption. If the Bible doesn't explicitly forbid a practice, human authorities are free to introduce it into the liturgy. The divines argued this permissive logic acts as an incubator for idolatry. By allowing human invention to slip into the sacred space of worship, the Church subtly replaces divine mandates with human preferences. They codified this into a strict theological equation. Human invention, when added to divine worship, equals idolatry. To make sense of the sweeping reforms they published in the 1645 Directory of Public Worship, we have to examine the uncompromising logic that drove them, the regulative principle of worship. The Assembly derived this strictness directly from Old Testament case studies. The text repeatedly demonstrates a divine jealousy over exact protocols. In Genesis 4, Cain presents an offering from the fruit of the ground. God rejects it. The text establishes early on that subjective human sincerity cannot validate a sacrifice God did not authorize. This strictness escalates violently in Leviticus 10, with the execution of the priests Nadab and Abihu. Their infraction is precisely documented. They offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded. The response is immediate execution by fire. We see this in 2 Samuel 6. As the Ark of the Covenant is transported, the oxen stumble. Uzzah reaches out to stabilize it. Despite his good intentions, touching the Ark violates strict Levitical protocols, and he is struck dead. Across these accounts, a consistent standard emerges. God's judgment isn't limited to malicious rebellion. He aggressively punishes well-intentioned, unauthorized innovation in his worship. These case studies formed the battleground for a massive 17th century clash between two entirely incompatible methods of reading Scripture. On one side is the normative principle, the operating system used by the Anglican, Roman Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox traditions. The normative principle asks a single question: is a practice explicitly forbidden by Scripture? If no, it is permitted. This treats the biblical text as a loose baseline, intentionally leaving massive gaps in the liturgy for newly invented human traditions. The Reformed tradition, led by the Westminster divines, countered with the regulative principle of worship. It asks a different question: is a practice explicitly commanded by Scripture? If the answer is no, it is forbidden. Through the lens of the regulative principle, the normative approach is highly presumptuous. It assumes God will accept and bless worship elements that he never actually asked for. To enforce this standard, the divines expanded their definition of the second commandment far beyond the prohibition of physical statues. They anchored their argument in the theological concept of will worship, a term drawn directly from the Apostle Paul in Colossians chapter 2. Will worship is defined as any religious practice born from human imagination, historical tradition, or personal preference, rather than a specific divine mandate. The Westminster Larger Catechism applies this aggressively. Question 109 lists the sins forbidden in the Second Commandment, explicitly condemning any religious worship not instituted by God himself.
The text goes further, labeling these superstitious devices as corrupting the worship of God. In 1645, the Assembly translated these strict theological boundaries into a practical working document, the Directory for the Public Worship of God. To avoid logistical absurdity, the divines separated the unchangeable elements of worship, like prayer, reading Scripture, preaching, singing psalms, and sacraments, from the circumstances. Circumstances are practical details, like the building, the 10 a.m. start time, and the use of the English language. The Directory used this framework to strip away the rigid written liturgies of the Anglican Church, replacing them with a purely word-centric sequence. The standard Puritan Sunday began with a solemn invocation for the Spirit's presence. This moved directly into consecutive public readings of the Old and New Testaments, eventually building to a massive comprehensive intercession known as the Long Prayer. By isolating the immutable elements from the logical circumstances, the 1645 Directory shifted the entire focus of the service. The congregation was no longer performing a human-authored ritual. They were engaging in a spiritually directed encounter with the biblical text. This strict regulative framework also produced two of the most historically jarring outputs of the Reformed tradition: the mandate for exclusive psalmody and entirely a cappella worship. This diagram illustrates the argument against musical instruments. The divines viewed instruments not as timeless tools of praise, but as specific components of the Old Testament ceremonial law, bound to the physical temple alongside animal sacrifices and burning incense. This triggers the theological concept of abrogation. These physical ceremonial shadows were completely fulfilled and abolished by the arrival of Christ. Just as the church no longer slaughters lambs, they no longer utilize Levitical instruments. The New Testament replacement protocol demands highly spiritual, vocal worship. As Hebrews 13:15 states, we offer the sacrifice of praise, the fruit of our lips. This logic extended to the lyrics themselves. The Reformed position notes that God has already provided a perfectly inspired 150-chapter songbook in the Psalms. Because the New Testament lacks any explicit command to compose uninspired, human-authored hymns, the regulative principle strictly limits congregational singing to the biblical text. Removing instruments and uninspired hymns intentionally centers the congregation's focus on the finished work of Christ and his precise, inspired word. The Westminster divines constructed the regulative principle as a protective boundary, safeguarding the liturgy from human encroachment. This strict protocol acts as a firewall. It safeguards the church against the human heart's innate tendency to manufacture idols out of its own preferences. By demanding an explicit divine command for every single element of the liturgy, the divines successfully purged the arrogance embedded within the normative principle. This complete architectural teardown ensured that the church submits only to the God of Scripture, exactly as he demands to be approached. They proved a defining theological axiom. In matters of divine protocol, human innovation is never equivalent to devotion. As the Apostle John warns at the close of his first epistle, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." True worship is defined not by what humanity wishes to offer, but strictly by what God has consented to receive.